Alice Wood. It was a sunny afternoon in Cheshire, June 2021. The kind of day that feels too normal to end in tragedy. But as 23-year-old Alice Wood climbed into her car, rage burned behind her eyes. Her boyfriend Ryan Watson was standing just yards away, unaware that he was seconds from death. Alice didn't scream, she didn't argue. She simply drove forward and didn't stop. The impact crushed Ryan against a garden wall. Witnesses said she hit him once, then again, and again. Not in panic, not in confusion, but with intent. Neighbors ran out, someone called emergency services, but it was too late. Ryan's injuries were catastrophic, he was pronounced dead at the scene. Alice Wood was arrested on the spot. Their relationship had begun like many others, university sweethearts, laughter at festivals, matching photos on social media. But behind closed doors, the cracks were growing. Friends noticed the arguments. Ryan's family described him as gentle, laid back, the kind of man who avoided conflict. But Alice had a temper, and when it flared, it could fill a room. In the months leading up to Ryan's death, their relationship became strained. Messages recovered later revealed jealous outbursts, accusations, and a toxic power dynamic that no one fully understood until it was too late. On the day of the killing, they had been at a friend's party. Alice had been drinking. Witnesses later said she appeared furious after an argument. When she got behind the wheel, Ryan followed her outside, possibly to calm things down. But instead of peace, he met violence. In court, Alice Wood claimed it was an accident, that she panicked, that she didn't see him. But CCTV told a different story. The footage showed her reversing, repositioning, then accelerating toward him multiple times. The jury watched in silence. Her defense unraveled. In May 2022, Alice Wood was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 18 years for the murder of Ryan Watson. The judge described her actions as merciless and driven by rage. Ryan's family wept in court. His sister said, "He trusted her. He loved her. He didn't deserve to die like that." This was not just a case of a relationship gone wrong. It was a clear example of coercive control turned fatal. Of a young woman whose anger took everything, and who now faces a lifetime remembering what she's done. But for Ryan, there are no appeals, no second chances. Just a life lost too soon, at the hands of someone he thought he knew. 2. Emma-Jayne Magson. He was gasping for air, bleeding, staggering, confused. Yet Emma-Jayne Magson didn't call for help. She let him collapse outside their home, wheezing the last words of his life. When paramedics finally arrived, it was already too late. In the early hours of March 27, 2016, 26-year-old James Knight lay dying in a Leicester street, stabbed straight through the heart. The woman responsible? His girlfriend, 23-year-old Emma-Jayne Magson. What began as a typical night out turned fatal by dawn. The couple had been drinking again. Their relationship was volatile, toxic, and known to police. Friends described it as a roller coaster of violence, love, and control. James had even warned people he was scared of her. Still, they stayed together. On that night, their argument turned physical in a taxi. CCTV later showed Magson arriving home alone, visibly angry. James showed up later, stumbling, trying to talk to her. What happened next would never be caught on camera, but the aftermath was undeniable. Magson stabbed James once in the chest with a steak knife, piercing his heart. She didn't call 999. She didn't try to stop the bleeding. Instead, she let him deteriorate. When he collapsed in the front yard, she told the ambulance crew he had taken drugs, a lie that cost him any chance of survival. Later, evidence revealed that Emma searched for James's location using a phone tracking app after stabbing him, indicating full awareness that he was in danger. Prosecutors described it as a callous and deliberate act. She showed no emotion during police interviews. When asked why she didn't help him, she offered no real answer. In 2017, Emma-Jayne Magson was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 17 years. But in 2020, her case was brought back to appeal court on claims of emotionally unstable personality disorder. A retrial was granted, not to erase the crime, but to reassess her state of mind. In 2021, after hearing new psychiatric evidence, the jury reached the same conclusion: guilty. The sentence stood. The court heard that James Knight was a hard-working father, a man trying to leave a chaotic relationship, pulled back in by guilt, manipulation, and trauma. His family described the years before his death as a cycle of fear and silence. At the sentencing, his mother said, "James didn't die instantly, he suffered, and she did nothing." Emma-Jayne Magson was not a stranger to violence. She had assaulted James before. Police had been called to their home multiple times, but no one imagined she would kill, until she did. This was not just a case of a drunken fight gone wrong. It was a slow-burning tragedy, a woman whose anger ruled her, a man who stayed too long, and a night that ended not with a goodbye, but a knife in the heart. Through Natalie Bennett. It wasn't premeditated. It wasn't planned. But it was brutal. In July 2021, the quiet town of Nottingham was rocked by a killing so sudden, so ferocious, that even seasoned officers called it one of the most violent they'd ever seen. The weapon? A claw hammer. The killer? Natalie Bennett. The victim? Her partner, Kamil Leszczynski. They had been in a relationship, living together in a small flat. To the outside world, they were just another couple trying to get by. But behind closed doors, the relationship was turbulent. Neighbors heard shouting, friends recalled tense conversations. And Natalie, 47, was described by some as emotionally unstable, often consumed by jealousy and paranoia. On the night of the murder, something snapped. The trigger? Still debated. But what's known as this: Kamil was in the bedroom when Natalie attacked. She struck him repeatedly in the head and face with the hammer. The blows were so forceful, forensic experts said his injuries were catastrophic. She then dragged his body to the bathroom, covered him with a towel, and left him there, dead. She didn't call the police. She didn't seek help. She waited over a day before telling anyone. When officers finally entered the flat, they found the scene soaked in blood and Kamil's lifeless body partially hidden. Natalie's explanation? "I can't remember." She claimed she had blacked out, that she had been drinking, that it wasn't her. But the evidence said otherwise. In court, prosecutors described the attack as prolonged, frenzied, and deeply personal. A post-mortem revealed over 20 separate injuries to Kamil's skull and face. It was a killing done in rage, not panic. Natalie Bennett pleaded guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Psychiatrists argued she suffered from a personality disorder and was mentally unwell at the time of the attack. But the judge made it clear, despite her mental state, she was responsible for her actions. The court sentenced her to 16 years in prison. Kamil's family, devastated, described him as kind, loyal, and trusting. He had come to the UK from Poland in search of a better life. He worked hard, kept to himself, and loved deeply. But that love placed him in the path of someone who, in a moment of uncontrolled violence, destroyed everything. This case didn't have the complexity of planning or the deception of calculated murder. But it revealed something just as chilling. That sometimes, the people closest to us can become the most dangerous, not through cold intent, but through unchecked rage. And when that rage is armed with something as simple as a hammer, the results can be just as deadly. For Farieissia Martin. It began with a lie, and ended with a life taken. On the surface, Farieissia Martin was just 22 years old, a mother of two, living with her boyfriend in Toxteth, Liverpool. But beneath that image was a relationship steeped in volatility, arguments, and accusations of infidelity. And on the night of November 28, 2014, it all unraveled in one horrifying moment. Her partner, Kyle Farrell, had stepped out that evening. When he returned, an argument broke out, one of many that had filled their home in recent months. Farieissia would later say she feared he was cheating. Kyle denied it. Voices rose. Then, silence. In that silence, she grabbed a kitchen knife. One thrust, straight into his chest. Kyle, just 21 years old, staggered backward. Farieissia didn't call for help immediately. Instead, she called a friend. Then lied to police, telling them Kyle had arrived already wounded. But the timeline didn't add up. Paramedics rushed him to the hospital, but the wound was too deep. He died that night. When officers questioned her, Farieissia stuck to her story. She said she didn't know what happened, that Kyle had fallen on the knife, but evidence told a different story. Forensics matched the angle of the wound to an upward stabbing motion, not an accident. And text messages revealed growing tension in the days leading up to the killing. The trial was painful. Both families sat in the courtroom, hearing the details of a relationship that had turned sour long before that night. Friends of the couple said they had seen bruises, heard arguments, and noticed emotional abuse, but no one expected it would turn deadly. Farieissia eventually admitted to stabbing Kyle but insisted it was not murder, that she acted in fear, that she snapped. The jury agreed only partly. In 2015, she was convicted of manslaughter, not murder, a distinction that would divide opinion. She was sentenced to 13 years in prison, a punishment many saw as too lenient. Kyle's family said justice was not served. His mother, in a heartbreaking statement, said, "He was a good son, a loving father, and he died for nothing, over jealousy and lies." Farieissia Martin's case raised deeper questions about young relationships, emotional instability, and the thin line between love and possession. Some saw her as a woman pushed to the edge. Others saw a manipulator who used her vulnerability as a shield. But whatever the interpretation, the fact remains: a young man is dead, 2 children are fatherless, and a family has been shattered by a single decision made in anger. What began as suspicion ended in a fatal wound, and no matter how it's framed, accident, impulse, or fear, the outcome is the same. A life taken, a lie told, and a moment that can never be undone. 5. Jane Andrews. She worked for the royal family, elegant, polished, trusted. But behind the designer dresses and palace walls, Jane Andrews carried a darkness that no one in Buckingham Palace saw coming until it was far too late. Born in Cleethorpes, Lincolnshire, Jane climbed her way out of working-class roots with determination and charm. She earned a position many envied: a dresser for Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York. For years she traveled the world, picked out royal outfits, attended private events. But beneath the surface, Jane was spiraling. Behind her ambition was insecurity. Behind her charm, deep emotional instability. After being let go from the royal household in 1997, Jane sought a new identity. She met Tom Cressman, a wealthy businessman, charismatic and connected. Their relationship seemed glamorous on the outside: holidays in France, London parties, social clout. But it was also toxic. Jane reportedly wanted marriage. Tom didn't. He was controlling, sometimes cruel, and allegedly unfaithful. But he never expected Jane's final response. On the night of September 17, 2000, after a holiday argument in the south of France, tensions exploded when they returned to Tom's London flat. Jane later claimed Tom assaulted her. But that night, while he slept, Jane retrieved a cricket bat and a knife. She beat him, then stabbed him in the chest, killing him in his bed. She didn't call for help. She didn't stay. She fled the scene, vanishing for 4 days. A nationwide manhunt followed. Newspapers called her the killer royal aide. When she was finally arrested in Cornwall, she showed little emotion. At trial, Jane claimed self-defense. She said Tom had sexually assaulted her, that she feared for her life. But evidence painted a different picture. Tom had defensive wounds. The attack was described as sustained and ferocious. Prosecutors argued it was revenge, not survival. That Jane couldn't bear the humiliation of being rejected. In 2001, Jane Andrews was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. The courtroom fell silent as the verdict was read. The press branded her the fatal female, a twisted Cinderella who turned on her prince. But the story didn't end there. In 2009, Jane briefly escaped from prison, prompting another national search. She was caught within 48 hours and returned to serve out her sentence. And in 2015 she was released on license, a decision met with anger by Tom Cressman's family, who said she should never walk free. Our son doesn't get that chance. The case of Jane Andrews still haunts the British public, not just because of the violence, but because of how high she had climbed and how far she fell. From royal halls to a prison cell, from trusted aide to convicted killer, all over a relationship she couldn't let go. And it begs the question: what happens when status hides sickness? When rejection meets obsession? In Jane's case, it ended with blood on royal silk sheets and a legacy stained forever. 6. Dionne Christie. Dionne Christie was supposed to be a mother, a nurse, a woman trusted by those around her. But behind her quiet demeanor, she was plotting something unthinkable: the murder of her ex-boyfriend and father of her child. And the man she used to carry it out was her new lover. The victim was Antoine Dennis, a 34-year-old London man who had once loved Dionne deeply. Their relationship had ended years earlier, but they shared custody of their young son. By all accounts, Antoine was a devoted father. He had moved on romantically, but he remained active in his child's life. That ongoing presence, and perhaps the emotional residue of their past, seemed to gnaw at Dionne. In 2006, Dionne was now with Andrew Drew Green, a younger man who had recently moved into her flat. She manipulated him emotionally, sexually, and psychologically, planting seeds of jealousy and hatred toward Antoine. Over time, she fed Drew a story that Antoine was violent, that he posed a threat to her and their child, that something had to be done. Then came the plan. On May 20th, 2006, Dionne arranged a meeting with Antoine under the pretense of letting him see his son. But it was a trap. Drew Green was waiting nearby. As Antoine got into his car, Drew ambushed him. He stabbed him 11 times in a frenzied attack. Antoine collapsed in the street and bled to death in front of horrified witnesses. Dionne, meanwhile, played innocent. She told police she was shocked, heartbroken by the killing. But investigators quickly uncovered text messages, call logs, and testimonies that exposed the truth. She had coordinated the murder. She had even helped Drew flee and hide after the stabbing. In court, prosecutors described Dionne as the architect of the crime. Though she never physically wielded the knife, she had manipulated every piece on the board. Drew Green was convicted of murder, and Dionne Christie was found guilty of manslaughter and conspiracy to murder. She was sentenced to 14 years in prison. The judge said her actions were premeditated, cold, and motivated by a selfish desire to control the child's life. Antoine's family was shattered. His sister told reporters, "He wanted to be a good dad. He was punished for caring." The tragedy of this case lies not just in the loss of a young father, but in how easily trust can be turned into a weapon. Dionne Christie used love as bait. She used fear to manipulate. And in the end, she orchestrated the destruction of two men, the one she used and the one she hated. A deadly plan doesn't always require a gun or a motive of money. Sometimes, all it takes is jealousy, influence, and someone willing to believe your lies. Sharon Swinhoe. Some killers act in a moment of rage, others plan in silence. But Sharon Swinhoe brought something darker, a kind of cold cruelty that turned her home into a house of horrors. The year was 2012. The victim, Peter McMahon, a retired civil servant and former local government officer in Newcastle. He was 68, mild-mannered, generous, and tragically lonely. That loneliness would lead him to trust the wrong person. Sharon Swinhoe was 44 at the time. Manipulative, volatile, known to neighbors as confrontational and controlling. She had recently begun a relationship with Peter, a relationship she shared with another man, Joseph Collins, her co-defendant and former lover. What Peter didn't realize was that Sharon wasn't interested in love. She was after control and his money. Over time, she convinced Peter to move valuables into her flat, jewelry, personal papers, even cash. He began spending more time there, isolated from others, increasingly under her thumb. But in November 2012, Peter disappeared. His friends grew worried. Days passed. No sign of him, no calls, no texts. And then, a gruesome discovery. Peter's body was found stuffed inside a metal box, buried under debris in a garage linked to Joseph Collins. He had been beaten and strangled, his body covered in scratches and bruises. The box was sealed shut, like someone had tried to erase him entirely. But no erasure could hide what happened. The investigation quickly led back to Sharon and Joseph. CCTV, witness statements, and forensic evidence placed them near the scene. The prosecution laid out a horrifying sequence. Peter had been lured to Sharon's home, where he was stripped, attacked, and choked with a belt. He died slowly, terrified, betrayed by someone he thought he could trust. After the murder, Sharon reportedly paraded around wearing Peter's jewelry, a twisted trophy of her crime. In court, neither Sharon nor Joseph showed remorse. Their defense was full of contradictions and blame-shifting. But the jury saw through it. In 2014, both were convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 25 years. The judge called it a brutal and callous killing and described Sharon as deeply manipulative, dangerous, and utterly devoid of empathy. Peter's family was left with unspeakable grief. A man who had dedicated his life to helping others, reduced to a body in a box by the very person he welcomed into his heart. This wasn't just a murder. It was a psychological game, a slow dissection of trust, safety, and human decency. Sharon Swinhoe didn't just kill Peter McMahon. She turned his final moments into a nightmare of betrayal. In a world where loneliness drives people to seek connection, stories like this raise a disturbing question. What happens when the person offering love is the one planning your end? 8. Martyna Ogonowska. What began as a night of drinks and laughter would end with a single act of violence that shocked an entire community. In 2018, Martyna Ogonowska, just 18 years old, stepped into a taxi with 3 other people after a night out in Peterborough. Among them was 23-year-old Tyrone John Pierre, a man she had only recently met. He would never make it home. To outsiders, Martyna was a young woman trying to find her way, raised in care, struggling with emotional regulation, and fiercely protective of herself. That night, she was intoxicated, volatile, and increasingly paranoid. During the ride, something shifted. She later claimed Tyrone made advances she didn't want. Others in the car would say she simply became agitated, her mood turning suddenly, explosively. And then, the knife. Without warning, Martyna pulled a blade from her handbag and stabbed Tyrone once in the chest, deep enough to puncture his heart. The car erupted in screams. Tyrone collapsed in the back seat, bleeding out as the driver rushed to get help. Paramedics arrived quickly, but it was too late. Tyrone John Pierre was pronounced dead in the early hours of February 22nd. Martyna fled the scene. For hours, she disappeared, leaving police scrambling to understand what had happened. When she was arrested later that morning, she showed little emotion. Her explanation was chillingly simple. She felt unsafe, so she struck. But the evidence painted a different story. She had brought the knife with her, a conscious decision. There had been no direct threat from Tyrone, no struggle, no warning signs to anyone else in the car. Witnesses testified that Tyrone had been calm, even friendly. The prosecution argued that Martyna acted out of impulsive rage, fueled by alcohol, past trauma, and a desire to assert control in a world she felt threatened by. The trial was emotional. Tyrone's family described him as kind, thoughtful, and full of potential. A man who deserved more than to die in a taxi, on a night that was meant to be fun. Martyna's defense leaned heavily on her troubled upbringing, her mental health challenges, and a claim of self-defense. But the jury was unconvinced. In 2019, Martyna Ogonowska was convicted of murder and sentenced to a minimum of 17 years in prison. The judge acknowledged her traumatic past but stated clearly, carrying a weapon, using it with fatal force, and fleeing the scene were choices, not reactions. This case left behind not only a grieving family, but a complex conversation about youth, trauma, and responsibility. Martyna was not the monster the headlines suggested, but neither was she a victim. She was a young woman who made a devastating decision, one that ended a life and altered many others. Sometimes danger doesn't come from the person you fear, but from the one sitting right beside you, holding something you never see coming. 9. Michelle Mills. Michelle Mills didn't fit the stereotype of a killer. At 31 years old, she was a mother, a partner, and described by many as quiet, almost invisible in the background of her own life. But when her boyfriend, 32-year-old Stephen Wynne, was found dead in their Birmingham flat, the illusion of normalcy shattered. And what emerged was one of the UK's most disturbing domestic murder cases in recent years. It was May 2020, during the peak of the COVID-19 lockdown, when neighbors reported hearing loud arguments from the couple's flat. Police arrived to find Stephen's lifeless body on the floor. The initial scene looked chaotic but not immediately suspicious. Michelle claimed he had overdosed, that he'd been struggling, that she had woken up and found him unresponsive. But it didn't add up. And then came the autopsy. Stephen had 44 injuries, not from a fall, not from self-harm, but from repeated blunt force trauma to his head, neck, chest, and even his genital area. The post-mortem revealed signs of prolonged abuse, not a sudden act. Bruising patterns showed he had been attacked while helpless, possibly even while asleep. The report left no doubt. This was no overdose. This was murder. As detectives dug deeper, a harrowing picture emerged. Stephen had reportedly tried to end the relationship multiple times. Friends said Michelle had grown controlling, paranoid, even violent. He had confided that he feared her temper, that he felt trapped. But like many men in abusive relationships, he never sought help. He never believed anyone would take him seriously. The turning point in the investigation came from Michelle's own words. Her interviews with police were riddled with contradictions. She claimed confusion, memory gaps, then admitted to slapping Stephen a few times. But the forensic timeline told a different story. There was no sign of forced entry, no sign of another suspect. Only one person had the opportunity, the motive, and the history. In court, Michelle tried to maintain her version that she found him that way, that she panicked, that she didn't know what to do, but the jury didn't believe her. The injuries were too specific, too brutal, too personal. The judge described the attack as vicious and sustained, and noted that her refusal to seek help or call emergency services showed a complete disregard for human life. In 2021, Michelle Mills was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 18 years. This case forced a painful conversation about male victims of domestic abuse, how they're often overlooked, underestimated, or silenced by stigma. Stephen Wynn's story wasn't just a tragedy, it was a warning. Abuse doesn't always leave visible marks, and victims don't always come forward, especially when they're men. The most chilling part of this case wasn't the crime itself, but how long it may have been building, unnoticed, unspoken, and hidden behind closed doors. Janet Charlton. Janet Charlton didn't kill in a moment of passion or rage. She didn't use a knife. She didn't raise her voice. She used patience. She used deception. And she used poison. Her weapon was subtle, invisible, tasteless, and by the time anyone realized what she was doing, it was too late. It was 1994 in North Yorkshire when 48-year-old Christopher Charlton, a respected prison officer, suddenly began experiencing strange health symptoms. He was constantly tired, nauseated, his hair began to fall out. Doctors were baffled. They ran blood tests, checked for infections, even suspected cancer. But there were no clear answers. And then, he died. Seemingly out of nowhere. Christopher's death stunned the community. He was fit, active, and well-liked. No known illnesses, no red flags. It wasn't until his autopsy revealed high levels of thallium, a highly toxic substance once used in rat poison, that the truth began to unravel. Someone had poisoned him slowly, over time. The question was, who? Suspicion quickly fell on Janet Charlton, his wife of nearly 3 decades. Investigators learned she had recently taken out a large life insurance policy on Christopher. She had also spoken to colleagues and friends about her husband being a burden, suggesting she felt trapped. But the most damning evidence came from the smallest details. Police found traces of thallium in food containers inside the Charlton home. Janet's internet history, rare at the time, showed she had researched symptoms that mirrored thallium poisoning. And then there were her interviews. Her calmness, her contradictions, the way she described her husband's illness in almost clinical detachment, as though she had been studying it for weeks. Because she had. In court, prosecutors painted her as methodical and cold. A woman who wanted a new life, a fresh start, and financial freedom. The jury heard how she had dosed his meals over several weeks, watching him weaken, watching him suffer, and never once seeking help. The defense tried to claim the poisoning was accidental, that perhaps Christopher had come into contact with the chemical through work. But thallium is rare. And its presence in the kitchen pointed to just one conclusion. In 1995, Janet Charlton was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. The judge called her actions calculating and cruel beyond comprehension, and said the use of poison revealed a particular malice, not just to kill, but to watch the suffering unfold in silence. The case of Janet Charlton remains one of the UK's most chilling examples of slow, silent domestic murder, a reminder that not all killers shout or stab. Some smile, some serve dinner, and some wait quietly for death to arrive. When trust becomes a tool, even love can be lethal. What do these women all have in common? Not age, not background, not even motive. What links them is the mask of love. They were girlfriends, wives, partners, women who were supposed to be protectors of the home, keepers of the heart. But behind closed doors, they became something else entirely. Calculating, jealous, controlling, cold. We often think of danger as something loud, a shadow in a dark alley, a stranger in the night. But as these cases show, sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones already inside the home. They wear affection like camouflage. They say "I love you" before pouring the poison. They offer a hug before striking the fatal blow. Not all violence comes from rage. Sometimes it comes from obsession, fear of abandonment, or a twisted hunger for control. From Alice Wood mowing down her fiancé in a jealous fury, to Janet Charlton calmly dosing her husband with poison day after day, these stories remind us that love alone isn't always safe. And gender doesn't dictate guilt, abuse doesn't always wear a man's face, and evil, it doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. For every Stephen Wynne, Peter McMahon, Tyrone John Pierre, men whose stories ended too soon, there's a question we have to ask ourselves. How many more are suffering in silence, disbelieved because of outdated ideas about who can be a victim? These weren't just women who snapped. They were women who chose, who planned, who watched the life drain from someone they once claimed to love or pretended to. And in some cases, they wore the victim's jewelry the next day, partied as if nothing happened, or blamed everyone else but themselves. But justice, in the end, had a voice, and in courtrooms across the UK, that voice echoed loud and clear. Behind every smiling mugshot, behind every quiet neighbor, and every loving girlfriend, the truth was waiting to be heard. If you or someone you know is in a toxic or abusive relationship, regardless of gender, don't wait for things to escalate. Get help. Get out. Because when love turns lethal, it rarely gives a warning. Which of these cases disturbed you the most? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories the headlines never told you.